Alright, I got my fence here. Got my 9-inch piece. We just made 2 pencil marks where to put screws and where not to put screws. I'm taking my fence and I'm just flipping it upside down right now. That way I can work on it. And I'm going to take my 1/4-inch piece, make sure that I'm flush with the side and flush with the back, and my back of my fence is facing you. So if I'm flush there, I can see my 2 pencil marks right here that I just made. Alright, now with that in there, we want to go ahead and take one of our 8-inch pieces, 8 1/4, whatever it was. We want to butt it right up next to that piece. Let's see if I can turn this side. I want to butt it right up next to that piece, okay? Because this is going to be getting cut out here in a minute. Alright, with that butted up in there, we want to go ahead and once again mark where our blade area is. We do not want to put any screws there. So I'm just making a little pencil mark just to kind of indicate where I need to put my screws. Now, what I recommend is however many of these beds you made, okay, and I made 5 of them, you are going to put them together, sandwich them all together. Measure off from one side, we'll call this the back side where my hand's rubbing. Measure 3/8 of an inch in, which is kind of the center of our 3/4 inch plywood, because we're using 3/4 inch for this. Measure 3/8 of an inch in, and that's where you need to drill your holes according to where your marks are, your no cutting zone. You want to drill all of these at one time, either with a drill press or hand drill. Just make sure you drill straight, because these are going to be our interchangeable beds, and we want the screws to line up, the screw holes with our fence and everything to line up. So all we have to do is unscrew, remove one, replace the other, and everything is still a-okay and in line. Alright? Alright guys, on this front fence here, go ahead and countersink and screw on one of your removable bases here and get it in place, and take your other bases and go ahead and put the countersinks on those as well, because we're going to be using those a little bit later. Now go ahead and take your front face here and put it up against your jig, and I like to put a few clamps just to hold everything securely. And then I'm going to take an 1/8 inch drill bit and I'm going to drill a location for these bolts to go through, and I'm going to do it first with an 1/8 inch bit. On both sides. Now, depending on the bolts you use to go through here, you have a choice of, like, I use these tulip bolts a lot. They're just tulip bolts, they're T-bolts. Or I also use these furniture connector bolts that have the flat head on them. For this jig, I'm going to use the furniture connector bolts. So I have an matching Forstner bit for the size of the head. And I want to go ahead and, where I drilled that hole through, that 1/8 inch hole through, I want to go ahead and recess a hole in there a little bit so that head recesses flush into this front base. Now I'm going to go ahead and put it back in place. Get the clamps on it again. And I'm going to drill a 1/4 inch hole through for the shaft of the bolt, because I'm using a 1/4 20 connector bolt or a 1/4 20 toilet lid bolt, whichever one you want to use. And now with that drilled all the way through, this back hole here, I want to kind of waller it out a little bit from side to side with the drill bit, so I have adjustability, so I can move this back and forth, and you know, there's a little bit of play. Just side to side motion, you're creating an oblong hole. You don't need a lot of movement, just a very little bit, because on the micro adjusting, it's not going to take very much movement. So I've got good movement from side to side there. See that? Nice. Okay, with those furniture bolts in there, now you've got just a little bit of side to side motion, and that's what you want for the adjustability. Now I am going to just put on some of these little 1/4 20 plastic wing nuts. Alright, so now with those wing nuts on, the jig is basically constructed. Now we need to just work on the keys. I went ahead, like I said earlier in the video, we went ahead and attached one of the beds right now. We're going to make our first cut, and I'm going to show you how to do this for one key and everything, and you'll just repeat the process for your other keys, however many keys you decide to you want to use or what have you. The steps are exactly the same. But before we do the keys, we need to put on our little adjuster here, our little micro adjuster, and get our set screw in there. So let's do that. Okay guys, real quick before we get into the base and the keys and everything, this is going to be our little side here for our micro adjuster, and all it is 2 pieces of that 1/4 inch plywood. One piece is cut at 1 1/4 inch in width. The other one is a little less than 3/4, the same thickness as one of these 3/4 inch pieces of plywood. And that gets mounted right here on the side. On the back side, the little small piece gets mounted on this side there. So you should have a little opening in here like that. And that just gets screwed on with 2 screws. But before we do that, let's go ahead and put our set screw in here. In the front fence on the side, we're going to put a set screw, just put a screw in there that we can use a Phillips screwdriver to screw and unscrew to kind of adjust this fence. So all that is simply, I'm gonna put this in place. I'm gonna drill a hole through here. So I went right through our little adjustment arm and into the front face here. And now where this hole is that we just drilled, I'll drill that out wide enough for my Phillips screwdriver head to fit through there. And in the corresponding hole in the front, I'm just going to insert a screw. And I'm not going to bury it all the way in. I'm going to leave a little out. And as I said, we're going to make this hole a little bit wider. And then we're going to mount this on here, putting 2 screws into the back part of the fence, into the thickest part of this little setup. And all it is just 2 pieces glued together, like I just said. Alright, and that's it for the adjustment arm. So now my screwdriver will be able to fit in there, and when I loosen up these wing nuts in the back, I can micro adjust this fence like so. And then once I get my adjustment tuned, just tighten the fence back up. Alright, so that's the adjustment arm. Now let's get into making these bases. Alright guys, on the table saw using a thin strip rip guide, I went ahead and cut down my 5 keys, 1 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, 5/8, and 3/4. All of the keys are 11/32 of an inch thick. Okay? And when it comes to the keys, you want them dead on accurate for your each key. So we've got our 3/4, our 5/8, 1/2 inch, our 3/8 inch piece, and lastly our 1/4 inch piece. So once you have your keys made, and once again pay a little extra attention to these and get them fine-tuned just right. If you have to, you know, do a little bit of sanding and everything to get them dead on. They are once again 11/32 of an inch thick. The reason for that is on our base plates we're going to cut a little dado that matches the size of our keys, and in that, with that dado, when that key is glued in there, we want a 1/4 inch of that key sticking up above the top of the base. So that's why I did 11/32 of an inch thick. That way we can set a little bit of it down into that dado, and that'll help lock it in, and it'll leave us a 1/4 inch of key left on the top. Alright, so now we need to go ahead and get our individual bases cut, get measured over, and get the spot for our dados. And this is the part of the jig where it takes just a little bit of extra time, because we're going to be setting these up. Each step is going to be identical from one to the other, but in the setup, this is where our accuracy comes into play. Now, of course, we do have that micro adjusting ability on the fence, but this accuracy, if we get our bases as accurate as possible, then that's less micro adjusting we have to do. Okay, well, we got one of the bases attached over here. Now this base on the my left side is going to stay on permanently. These bases here are going to be, on the right side, are going to be the interchangeable bases with the interchangeable keys. Now the next steps here for setting up the keys and everything is going to be the same process for each key. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one process, and you just repeat those steps for each key. In my saw now, I've got a 1/4 inch dado stack in there because I'm going to start with my 1/4 inch key. And I've got my fence flushed up. Make sure that my micro adjusting screw is screwed in to where my fence is flush to get started. Tighten my fence back down. And we're going to go ahead and make a pass in here with the 1/4 inch blade in. Okay, where our 1/4 inch groove just cut, on the left side fence, it went ahead and cut that fence flush with the left side of the blade. On the right side fence for this fence, it went ahead and cut the right side fence flush with the right side of this blade. Now, from that cut on the right side, we need to measure over 1/4 of an inch, and it has to be pretty well exact. If you want, you can take a set of calipers set to exactly 1/4 of an inch, and you can make your reference mark using it. And that is where our dado is going to start for this particular key. So now what we need to do is take this bed off. While we have our 1/4 inch blade, and you're going to do this for each one of the keys, as I said. So while you have this your 1/4 inch blade in, make your 1/4 inch bed. While you have your 3/8, whatever, so on and so forth, up to 3/4, make each bed for each step. So we're going to set that aside, and now we want our our keys. If you remember, I said I made them 11/32 of an inch thick. We want 1/4 inch of that key sticking up above the base. So we only want to cut a shallow groove into this base that this key can lock into. Okay, so we're just going to get the blade height set. Okay, I went ahead and set up my miter gauge with an auxiliary fence, and I took a stop block here, and I've got the stop block set up to where my piece can slide right up next to it, and that will set my cut for exactly where it needs to be. And I've got a stop block on the top for some downward pressure just clamped on there, so I get some nice downward pressure. I've got the height of my blade set, and now I'm just going to make the cut. Okay, so with that little groove cut in there now, we can go ahead and once again I'm taking my calipers here, set to 1/4 of an inch, and making sure that my space between the right side of the fence, or the left side in my case, to the beginning of the groove equals 1/4 of an inch. And if it does, you're set. You can go ahead and take your key and get it into place. Alright, what I like to do is to actually take the base and screw it back into the jig. And it only needs one screw for this. Don't need both of them, just one. Just to hold it into place. So now that you have that screwed back in, you can go ahead and take your key and glue it into place into the slot. And that's it. Once it's glued in, go ahead and give her a test run. But those steps for making the little groove for the key to fit into, those are the same steps you repeat for each of your bases and each of your keys. And they'll be dead accurate. If you take the time to get them set up, they'll be dead accurate every time. And if not, you've got a little bit of micro adjustability over there to fine tune your cut. So I'm going to go ahead and get this glued in, and we're actually going to do a test run with it, and that'll be it. Alright guys, while the glue in that key is drying, I went ahead and just marked 2 lines here, 1.5 inches apart, and I want to cut a groove in there, a dado in there, that is as thick as this 1/4 inch piece of material here. That way I can make my backplate replacements. So I've got my dado stack height set. I'm still going to use my miter fence with my auxiliary fence on here, just to kind of simulate how you can do it if you don't have a dedicated dado sled. All set up. Let's get her cut. Alright, now that we have the dado grooved into the front fence here, I'm going to go ahead and make you some corresponding back pieces to go in there. Now, I went ahead and pre-drilled mine into this fence a little high. I should have went lower with it, about center, halfway in. That way, once I use this side, I could very easily flip it over and use the other side and everything, but I offset my hole so I'll only be able to use one at a time, which is fine. I always got little scraps like this laying around. But yeah, just think about that when you're drilling this hole and countersinking it. Bring it down to about the center. That's high enough to where it'll clear your blade and everything, your cuts, but also low enough that you can actually flip this over and use the other side, so that way you get double the use out of each one. As I said, I offset my hole a little too much. Make sure that you drill all of your holes through each piece evenly, so that way your screw hole will always be where it needs to be. And with everything set, I've got a small little 1/4 inch screw here. Screw that on, and there you go. There's my replaceable back piece. Now make sure when you cut that dado groove in there that you're flush when this back piece is in there, that everything is nice and flush so don't throw you off. Okay, with the jig back together, we're ready to make our first test cut. Now, if you remember in that joint making video that I just put out, when you're setting the blade height, put your piece of material on top of the base. You got to account for that base and set your blade height. I like my blade to be just a little fingernail grab above the top of the stock that I'm cutting. That way the fingers will protrude a little bit and they can be sanded flush nicely when everything's said and done. Also, check the gap between your key and your blade. Make sure that it's equal to your blade thickness and your key, which I am. If not, that's what that little adjustment screw is. Loosen your fence and make the adjustments accordingly. And I'm all set. So I've got my 2 test pieces here. I'm going to take the back one, put it up against the key. I'm going to offset the front one by 1/4 inch, since that's what the key we're using. With that set, I like to put a clamp on the first cut. Make sure everything stays nice and firm while we're making this cut. With that, we're ready to go. Alright, now that blade is stopped, now that we've got our keys cut, we can go ahead and test our fit. And that is a nice fitting finger joint, and my fingers are protruding. They're probably protruding just a little bit too much, so I have to do a little extra sanding, but they are protruding the way I like them, so I can sand everything flush. But let's get a close-up of that, and so you can see how nice and accurate that is. So as you can see how nice and accurate that is, and as you can see my fingers protrude a little bit, so a little bit of sanding. Once everything is glued up, not a problem. But nice fitting joints there, and that's my 1/4 inch key. So now I'll go ahead and make my other bed keys for the interchangeable beds, the other bases, and I'm set. Now I've got 2 of these jigs in the shop. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this build, and please give this a try if you want to make it one for yourself. Now, just to answer a couple questions in this video, a couple of people on the joint making video asked if I would show a demonstration of making finger joints without a dado stack, because in some places dado stacks are not permitted, or certain saws don't hold a dado stack. That in itself is an entirely different jig and an entirely different setup. So I'm not going to get into it into this video. But what I can tell you is this jig here, imagine if you have a router table and your router table has a miter slot on it. These protruding arms that ride in the miter slot of my table saw, well, imagine one of the arms protruding so it rides in the miter slot of your router table. And you can use this jig on your router with your 1/4 inch bits, 3/8, 1/2 inch, whatever size you want. So some adjustments will have to be made depending on where your router tables
miter slot is compared to the blade. So you just may have to make some measurement changes and everything, but you could absolutely modify this for a router table to make your finger joints on a router table. As far as doing it individually without a dado stack, I'm going to have to research that a little bit more, because I think the only way to do that, because your pieces, as you cut them, if you're only using a single cut at a time, a single blade, you need to be able to move your pieces over for that entire cut before locking onto your key. So that would take some type of screw advance, some type of advancement, some kind of accurate way. And Matthias Wandel's screw advance jig would work great for that. And there's a lot of other models or designs of that, you know, advanced screw jig. I think that's what it's called, is advanced screw box joint jig. So I think that would be the only way to do it on the table saw with a single blade. I'll look into that a little bit more, and maybe I'll do a follow-up to this and answer that question. But just think about the alternative of using this on your router table and modifying it for your router table's miter slot. With that being said, guys, as always, thank you for sticking with me through this build. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next week, I'll see you soon.